My experience is that whenever I talk with the public about the topic, the question always came up, okay, autonomous driving is nice, but I really like the sound of the engine. I really like the feeling of driving. So my first question to you goes like, what is the fate? What is the fate of internal combustion engine? Karotta, what do you think? What would you say if somebody would ask you this question?
Although I understand completely why you posed this question to me. And the official language of this panel discussion is English, but the shortest answer that I can possibly give you to the question is quite universal. It's so I hope you know that this was supposed to be a sound of a horse. People loved their horses, and some of them still do. But people are not very sad that they do not have to go from another place to another place to another place on their own horse or somebody else's horse, because it was just not horribly convenient. We had better solutions. And the same is true for cars and internal combustion engines. I am in many ways infatuated by the sheer complexity of internal combustion. It's very beautiful as a mechanical solution to a problem. It's fantastic, but it's a little bit like the Rube Goldberg machines. I don't know if you're familiar with those machines. Probably best known from these children's films, which are machines that are horribly complicated with levers and balls and feathers and little fire, and they try to achieve something that is very, very simple at the end in a horribly complicated way. Now, the internal combustion engine is pretty much the same. It's a very interesting, superbly complicated, very bad answer to the problem of getting people from one place to another. And as the emission requirements get stronger and stricter, which is a very good thing, the internal combustion engine gets more complex and complex and complex, and in a way proves every year that it gets less good at what it tries to achieve by being complex. Even though you can find, or you can always find parameters that are measurably better than they were a decade ago or some years ago, and that's true. And in a way, it keeps improving, but the horrible complexity of the improvement just shows that this is a technology that should be abandoned at all. I mean, completely and forgotten.
Okay, not probably directly, but to the engine question, driving license somehow connects to. And then I'd like to ask you, what do you think the fate of driving license will be in this autonomous world?
So I think partly extending on that one, I think there's sometimes a misperception of electric vehicles where people think, oh no, they're milk floats. As soon as someone drives one, they kind of think, oh yeah, it's better, it's faster, it's silent. If you want your electric car to vibrate all the time and make a lot of noise, just detune the radio and misalign the wheels, you'll achieve the same effect. But on that question of driving licenses, I mean, it's somewhat a hypothetical question. If presently we're not at a state where we can fully automate our cars, the safest system I'm aware of presently is Waymo, which is Google's subsidiary. Manages about 5,500 miles between people turning the system off, disengaging it, which compared to the average driver in the USA does roughly 165,000 miles between. So today you need a driver present, and that driver needs to have a license. That driver also needs to be very well educated on the fact that that system is not ready to be in control in all instances. So today, absolutely, you need a driver. That driver needs to be aware. We might even need another layer on top of that, where you want drivers to be educated on how to use an autonomous system. So as we've had adaptations to the licensing system in the UK, where recently people have had to learn how to use a GPS system. So more safely knowing how can you be in control of a vehicle, and telling them that you shouldn't be prodding your GPS while you're traveling at 70 miles per hour, how you should pull over, how you should interact with that safely while using a car. There could even be an extra bit of those tests telling people when the system is making a bleeping noise at you, this is how you should react, this is how you safely take control of the vehicle. I've seen some studies saying that we are less safe than if we had just woken up after sleeping when we're trying to overtake from a self-driving vehicle. It's like the test that says, oh, I don't quite know what to do here. You've got about 5 or 10 seconds where it's almost exactly like you've just been nudged from your sleep and said, can you take control of this vehicle at 70 miles an hour? So maybe we need more currently. In a hypothetical state where it's gone beyond that 165,000 miles per disengagement, then I don't think we need licenses. If it's purely autonomous, no need to overtake, then no license is required.
Okay, any other opinions regarding driving license? Ádám?
So actually, autonomous car is going into a way when so the car is self-driving, which means that the driver won't be in control, so driving license will not be required anymore, and driving a car will be an offense, actually, and that's because driving is definitely a dangerous activity, and that's a policy issue that the legislator requires a license to drive a car. However, as long as autonomous cars are on the way, the ultimate purpose would be to make our society so free of any accidents and free of any health hazards which might be caused by driving a car.
I think driving licenses are, a number of driving licenses are already decreasing these days all over the developed world. Less and less young people are seeing the driving license as something which really is a status symbol or an essential part of the daily life. So I think that we should think about the future of driving license, but at the very moment of 2018 we are in, we should focus even more, providing more options for the people who don't want to drive their own metal box around and attach their lives to them. And I think this is a real issue. And I agree with the other speakers that for sure, with autonomous mobility, less and less people will opt to have a driver license as more and more ride-sharing, on-demand, other solutions will pop up, micro-mobility will grow, less and less people will look for the possibility to drive their own cars, or we can call it to turn to be in charge of a car if it's needed. But for sure there will be people who will get that ability, and for sure that even in the fully autonomous world, we will have a few people who has the right and ability to drive a car, as the same way how people still have the ability to ride a horse, but they don't do it in traffic usually. So I think the fate of the driving license is kind of the same.
Okay, thank you. Connecting to your answer and going back to the survey what we had regarding who owns a car right now, my next question pops up. So if I really think about automated driving or autonomous drive, what do you think? Will it be economically feasible to own a car? So for an individual, what do you think the economical case is the most feasible in this case?
I think the answer is clearly no, if we can just go back the other direction. The answer is clearly no, and I think this is the major threat of autonomous vehicles at the moment for cities, and this is what we have to address in the earliest stage before people start to ride around autonomous vehicles and it becomes a political issue how to restrict this in a way, at least in the downtown cores. As far as we see transport modeling these days, forecasting the future where people have essentially two options. One is to ride some kind of public transport, metro, trams, whatever. And the other is to, at least for commuting from longer distances, not just using a bicycle in the downtown, but to commute from longer distances. And the other option is being driverless taxis, shared driverless taxis, which is an utopia at the moment, but still the way where technology goes, as we see that Google, Uber, these companies, essentially service providers, are the most advanced in testing autonomous technology. We see that they will try to provide services, taxi-like services, and they want to change the culture of ownership in the car industry. And this leads us to a situation where people, not just who are driving their own cars at the moment, but people who are riding public transportation at the moment could be shifted to these driverless operations, and this can easily cause more congestion on our roads than what currently we experience. So we have to plan ahead, and we shouldn't let us consume the same kind of marketing bullshit as all the humanity consumed with cars 50, 60 years ago, when General Motors and all the other car companies in the US in the late 1930s, early 1940s and 50s were not just selling cars, but they were selling a new lifestyle of a car-dependent society, and people loved it. And we changed our whole urban planning culture for cars. We love historic cities. We love how historic cities look like, how their scale is human, how we can easily walk around. But legally, we cannot build it anymore. For sure, not in the US, but not in most of other developed countries as well, because we need a lot of parking spaces under houses. We need a lot of parking around. We have to leave a lot of public space between houses just to let cars roam around. So we essentially designed our urban life around cars in most of our modern cities, in different ways in the US or in Europe, but that's just a detail. And after 30, 40, 50 years, people started to realize that this won't work. We cannot provide enough space. If we want to see the extreme of this, we have to go to Los Angeles and see what happened there, where 2 people out of 100 are using public transport, and more than 50% of all public land, or all land of the city is used by parking cars or traffic lanes. So this was a dead end. And now cities all around the world trying to scale it back. And we see it in many cities that more space for pedestrians, more for public transport, etc. Sustainable mobility. There are one conference about this topic each week. But still it's a struggle because there are people who already have their habits. It's a political issue. You cannot take away their free parking and whatever. So I think the same can happen with autonomous driving. We see that, oh, this is a shiny new technology. It's cheaper, it's nicer. You can get from your home to your office easily. You don't have to change from bus to train, and you walk to the bus stop. And in the end, we will just it will just lead us to even more congestion in our cities. And we have to consider this and see this very well in advance to regulate it in a proper way.
Connecting to the cheaper and nicer economical topic to your answer, still the same question, but my question would be that as well in the previous presentations we saw that there are different levels of autonomy with a system or with a car, right? How this will be cheaper? Do you think the levels build upon each other are prerequisite of achieving the fully automated cheap way of driving, or this is a parallel development path?
Shall I?
Yeah.
Those who know me know that I love driving. I love driving in the extreme sense of the word as well. So I spend a lot of time on racetracks. I've constructed race cars. I know how they work, and I love them. But I have experienced firsthand the development of driver assistance systems, which is pretty much the stepping stone of later autonomous technologies. And the one thing that is obvious is that these systems make driving safer. That's for sure, and we have statistics to prove that. The other thing is that cars that require less and less from people give also less and less feedback, which is in a way good, because feedback, which is generally in cars called as NVH, which is short for noise and vibration and harshness. So you can consider all those information, because noise about the road is information, but it's also tiresome and you generally don't like it. And it seems that people are not that much into having these sort of feedbacks from the road, and they don't want to be bothered by the nuisances of getting from point A to point B. They like less and less of that, which calls for higher levels of automation, which in turn, partly because they are less involved in their minds during the driving, because of the less input that the car requires from them, makes harder to be alert at driving, which means that either more people start dying because of pushing their smartphones in the car or doing anything else but driving, or we have to replace the lowering human attention by the driver aid systems, and this is what we are seeing right now. Without getting into details about the levels of autonomy, because most of you are probably familiar with it, the thing is that the idea is that level 5 is when no human intervention is required ever, probably not even possible. Level 4 is when, in very extreme circumstances, you have some control over the car, but basically the car does everything for you. And level 3 is when you are supposed to be able to regain control in certain situations when the car cannot handle the situation itself. Now, the general consensus is that level 3 and 4 should be as short as possible, because people will die because of the psychological inability of a human being to regain control in a situation which is complicated enough that the system itself cannot sort it out. We won't be able to do that ever. So while I think that theoretically it's not possible to just jump over this period, because this is not how progress generally works, but this is the ideal way. So we should spend the least amount of time in the level 3 and 4 autonomy. There are ways around that, probably with the geographical areas that a car can operate in a self-driving fashion, etc. I wouldn't like to go into details around that, but the thing is that we have to keep this very short. And the other thing is, I have to admit that I came full circle during the last 15 years, because I came from the polar opposite of what Dávid just said. And I found myself agreeing with all of his words, even to the point of being very angry about both my own former ideas about it, and both about the fact that we have built our cities and our environment so much around cars that even though now we are seeing that this is very bad for us, it makes it very, very hard to make anything else work, because everything that we have invested into this infrastructure and this world around us is so much against everything else but cars. And people usually want their lives to be better, and just saying them that, okay, now it will be a little bit worse, but later on it will be better, it just flat out don't work. So we have tried this several times and it never works. The only thing that works is that we somehow can break down these issues in a way that the incremental changes in themselves are good, or are not bad for the people. So if you just tell to somebody that, hey, you shouldn't drive your car because you are not going that far and the weather is nice, you should go by bike, but going by bike feels worse, he or she will not do it, and that's bad for all of us. So we have to turn our attentions into making all these alternatives better for the people who would use it, and also shaping the future of cars in a way that you just don't really feel that you need to have one absolutely, which is another very important from a communications point of view, because this whole market was about making people crave the possession of a car, and that's a bad thing. So what you really should crave is the ability from getting somewhere to another place easily without killing others. And that's a very demanding task from a communications point of view.
Connecting to the point of driverless cars, nevertheless, it's really a possession or not. The legal question arises, right? What happens in case of an accident? Are we ready? Is legislation ready to cover such issues?
Actually, the legislation already covers liability for dangerous activities. Definitely, it won't be the autonomous car, because there is always a person who will be liable, because objects cannot be liable. Actually, that's the manufacturer, or actually, in case of the autonomous car, that might be the manufacturer. But currently, it's still the driver. It's the driver who drives the car, and actually, it's a policy issue that this is the person who will be liable for any accidents that might happen with the car. And but I would like to raise that society is still not ready to accept all these autonomous cars. So I would also expect that there should be some terminal period. So there should be a prerequisite to have these prongs till the cars become fully autonomous. And that's because human nature just has a fear vis-a-vis technology. So we have a basic fear from technology, and I think that car manufacturers still have not solved the existence of autonomous cars, and that's a policy issue that also the law, so the legislator must follow all these developments.
Excuse me, I promise I will be short, but we get this question a lot as well, and there is one thing that's very important to know. People really do feel anxious about handing over autonomy during driving. But the situation is that it is pretty obvious that people are just not good at driving at all. I mean, not even me. I have periods in my life when I'm a pretty good driver because I'm fully concentrated, especially if I'm on a racetrack. I know that I will be close to the edge, and I love it. But I'm a horrible driver in a lot of other cases when just going home or being anxious or thinking about something else. And all of us are the same. We are not at the same level of driving ability during our lives. And yet we all drive regardless of how adept we are at that very moment about driving. And the thing is that more than 94% of all fatalities and injuries in driving are caused by human accident. That basically we can say with a rounding error that all of them. Now, I'm sure that there will be problems and accidents and death arising from autonomy as well, because it's inevitable, especially during the transition phase, which will be the hardest for everybody. But we will get rid of that 94%, and that's way, 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 way more than all the other new problems that we will have to solve from this regard.
So this means that if you would take me for car racing, then I would need to trust you, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So Ben, what do you think? How can we trust machines, seeing this real fact that almost 100% of the accidents are caused by human error?
Yeah, I think there's also something very important said there as well, that it is inevitable that there will be accidents caused by autonomous systems. Even like there will be no position where we get to where there is a 0% chance of any accident happening. We can reduce the probability as much as we want, but it will never be zero. There's good reasons behind this. The main, like the statistical system that seems to work perfectly is phase probability theorem. You can trend towards 1, which is saying completely certain. You can trend towards 0, which is saying not at all, but never will you completely get there. It's the sort of thing, if I gave a 0% probability to my phone being in my pocket, I reach my hand in and it's not there, I can't update that probability. I need an infinite amount of evidence to say not. So there will always be some level of risk. And I think for us to know when we can release these level 4, level 5 autonomous systems, we need to know what our appetite for that risk is. It's good that we don't have autonomous cars allowed on the road without human supervision today because they're not as safe as human drivers. I think we can learn things from what we've seen. So if you look online, you can't actually see the most horrible part of the accident, but there was a video release of the Uber driverless car accident. It doesn't show you the actual point of the accident, but if you watch that as a driver, you see the moments leading up to it and think, I don't know how I, as a human driver, even if I were completely aware in that moment, could I have avoided it? You had milliseconds to react. It was unlit. It was on a large road, so you'd been driving quite fast. And the public outcry through that was very negative. People saying that Uber should close down their autonomous vehicle project. So we can learn a bit from that. To know people want an autonomous system to be some degree safer than a human driver before we're happy for it to happen. MIT also did some great things on this, a moral machines experiment, where if we're really polling society and learning what that stage is, and it might be that it needs to be 10 times safer, it might need to be 100 times safer, but we can gauge that point where society says, we know there will still be accidents, but I know that 94% is now a fraction of what it was, that the chance of my family, friends, other people generally, their chance of death or injury is so much lower. I know it's still there, but it's so much lower, I'm happy for us to turn over to autonomous. And we'll get to that stage.
Okay, Dávid?
I think we can learn from the examples of metros. What happened there is that there was around a decade in the 80s where metros in some cases were able to accelerate and brake and use their engines energy efficiently and without driver's intervention, but the driver was there and the driver was in charge. From the 90s there was around 20 years where there were some systems which were a bit ahead. There are still systems which are far behind in the world, but generally, as we see the most advanced systems, there were around 20 years where metro trains were driven by drivers, but the drivers were doing nothing else than just opening and closing the doors, and then giving the right for the train to drive itself from one station to the other. Not many people know, but the old Metro Line 3 trains, the old blue Soviet trains, driven by a French system, were working like this from 1990 in Budapest, Metro 3. The drivers was not driving the train at all in the tunnel, only managing it at the stations. Or the drivers was only driving when there was some failure of the system. And now we have the new Metro Line 4, which is still, I wouldn't call it level 5 from the car world, because there are still extreme situations where where there is a human intervention, but it's done from a dispatching center and not by one of the passengers on board or a crew on board. Many people thought, I was in charge of introducing the system to the passengers a few years ago, and many people were saying that we won't be able to exclude the driver or some kind of human staff from the trains for many years because the public won't trust it. The public didn't care at all. They just wanted to clear up the windows for them to look out and watch the tunnel with their kids. There was it wasn't an issue at all. You haven't read an article about people being afraid that the drivers were just taken away. And now for more than 2 years now, there is no driver and any BKV staff on any Metro Line 4 train. It's driven only by computers. There are only average people, passengers on board who cannot do anything with the train. Other than maybe giving emergency signals to the dispatching center. But it's still, there is a possibility of human intervention, but it's done from a center. And just to answer your previous questions from this point of view, I think that the money which is flowing into autonomous vehicles, surface vehicles, are looking at the possibility to change the car ownership into a service-based system. This is the reason why Waymo, Uber, and these companies are the most ahead. But even the European counterparts, which are mostly car manufacturer companies, they look at it at the same way. So if you ask Daimler, they still look at service-based solutions, and they are buying every taxi company in Europe to put together their own operations. So this means that the return of this money is considered to come from the changed way of operations. Just to make your ride more comfortable, just for you to make you able to play on your phone while you are driving your own car. This is not an economic model where this can return. You won't pay as more for your vehicle just to have this solution as much it would be needed to finance all this innovation which is going on. And this means that if it's a service, then it has to be somewhere between level 4 and level 5, where people can just feel like being passengers on a bus and they don't have to expect a situation where they have to drive. But I say level 4 or level 5 because I think that the metro example is important, because if there is an extreme situation and human intervention is needed, it will be done by the service provider, maybe from a continent away, and not by someone in the car. But we will see how this will work it out itself. And I think that the situation is, in terms of who is responsible for what, is again similar to the metro. If you jump ahead of a Metro Line 4 train in its braking distance, it will kill you, and there is no human who is responsible other than you. If you jump in outside of the braking distance, there is a very, very high chance, maybe not 100.0, but a 99.999, that the train will stop and you won't be hurt, because there is a system which provides that. So I think we will get to a point with this with autonomous cars. Yeah, if you are suicidal, or if there is a very, very bad situation where you just don't pay attention and you step in front of a moving car with well in the distance of braking possibilities, yes, maybe there will be an accident which is unavoidable, but then essentially the participant will be responsible who step in. But otherwise, we should expect, and I think the society will expect, these autonomous cars to stop in any other way. So in terms of Uber, yes, I think if we see this video footage, we can say that maybe a human would have done the same. But the question is why we have lidar and radar and all this stuff on these cars if it can see in the dark, and its abilities are only to compare with humans. So I think the expectation of the public will be that these cars should avoid every accident when it's not 100% clear that it was caused directly by the other human side, and it was unavoidable just by the rules of physics. All the other cases, the expectation of the society will be to avoid it.
Okay, so we heard a lot of opinions about safety and reliability of such systems. But even as we heard in the previous presentations, it's inevitable to avoid the topic of Internet of Things. Everything will be connected. What about security, cybersecurity, Ádám? What do you think?
Actually, this is also a public policy issue, that these cars shall remain secure also from third-party interaction. And also, if we consider all these terrorist attacks, and that terrorists are simply jumping on a train and hijacking a train or hijacking a bus or cars and causing major accidents. So that may also occur with an autonomous car, because through a hacker who hacks the IT system of the car, who enters the car from into remote mode and drives the car into and causes a huge accident. And actually, this is one of the policy issues that security must be regulated, and which also leads to a proprietary car model, that autonomous car won't be an open car, but rather a proprietary car, because all these the security and upgrades that everybody regularly upgrades its car to have the latest patches, so that IT hackers may not access its IT system.
Karotta, do you want to join?
Yes, there's a very interesting other issue around here, is that now when you are free to choose and buy your own car, you know that you will not get the same performance and safety benefits from an economy car and from a luxury car, a sports car, and from a small family car, etc. And you know that, and you make up your mind. There are cars now that can, for instance, brake at a much shorter distance than some other cars, which can be the difference between killing and not killing people. And yet, there are no rules that stipulate that you can only sell a car if it brakes as good as the other. We have some very old rules that stipulate certain parameters, but those are very easily achievable and have nothing to do with where the technology is now. Now, in the case of self-driving cars, when the safety of the system comes from a mixture of hardware and software capabilities, but the safety is very much dependent on the software side. It's a very interesting idea that you can even allow a worse software to be used. So if you have a fleet of, let's say, 10 million cars, which is not a crazy number considering the average output of a big car company now, and of that 10 million car strong fleet, you have a death ratio, I don't know, 55 people per year. And there's another comparable company which has a comparable service, and they have a death toll which is twice yours. Then it is not really legally acceptable that you can sell a car which is twice as likely to kill you. And the weird thing is that the current situation is very similar. We just don't care because we take it for granted that most of the time people will not die because of the car, but will die because of the driver. And we know that statistically it's true because of the 94%. But that will not be the case as you remove the human driver from the equation, which means that regulation might step in to sort of level the field in terms of a sort of a basic requirement in that regard. And that also means that, of course, you will hand over as soon as you hand over the driving side, you hand over the legal side as well.
And is it feasible that our cars will be weapons that will threaten us?
So I suppose that's one of the things of the cybersecurity of them. In an IoT example, people sometimes say the thing of IoT being like, would you be more afraid of being attacked by 1,000 duck-sized rhinos or a rhino-sized duck sort of thing? When we're dealing with driverless cars, they are very large bits of metal that travel very fast. So they need to be, I suppose, entirely secure. I think, as far as using them as weapons, if we were to kind of divide the types of fatalities that could be caused by AI, that would be just an intentional output of the thing. So the objective you're giving the AI or the autonomous vehicle to do that, I would like to think we would just make complete international treaties against it. There's something from Max Tegmark in his book Life 3.0 where he talks about different technologies in the past. So where we had biology, it had the potential to be kind of medicine or biological weapons. We had international bans against biological weapons. That was one done well. Chemical, similarly, we banned chemical weapons, and chemistry was very promising, very beneficial to us. Nuclear, we got there a bit late. Could have been perfect energy source, and that alone. Instead, it became weapons. AI could be that next thing, kind of the most promising tool we've ever created, or it could be lethal autonomous weapons. It could be kill bots, and it could be more fatal than nuclear weapons. So we want to completely ban that. I think there's also a step beneath that we'd want to completely prevent an autonomous vehicle from being able to do as well, which is what I'd call like an instrumental death that it would be caused. So that's saying like the car's objective is to get you to your destination as quickly as possible. But it's saying on the way there, maybe I could get you there 10 minutes quicker if I just go over this pedestrian. That also we wouldn't want to allow in any instance. That's not something we're willing to do. And if we do that, there could be a complete runaway scenario where it becomes the first situation anyway. I think the only instance where it can be tolerable is if it's accidental. And then, again, it's that sort of thing of what's our risk appetite. If we're saying we're only allowing it to go on the roads when we've reduced the number of accidents by 99%, and those things are only accidental. So it could go into a situation where it thinks there is almost no chance of this happening, but because we need to reach a destination, I need to go at this speed. Saying that there is no appreciable possibility of accidents happening, then that's what we can allow to happen.
Okay, so opportunities and threats. We discussed from perspective of the car and the driver, but what is about the closed environment around us, especially cities and public transportation? What are the threats and opportunities for the cities?
I think it's very important for cities to understand that autonomous technology and the service providers who are promoting it is two different things. Autonomous technology can and should be used for trams, for buses, for all the fixed route, high capacity transit we use in all our cities. All these companies are not focusing on that. There are some trials, there are some initiatives for example, self-driving trams or self-driving buses, but this is not in the focus of the main innovators of this field. For cities, it's essential to have high-capacity public transportation in the future. There are traffic modelings which are clearly showing that, what I said before, only shared driverless private cars or even minivans couldn't solve the transportation needs for a city, even just the size of Budapest, not even larger cities. So I think to somehow enhance innovation in public transportation and the usage of this technology is very important. And on the other hand, I think it's very important for cities to understand in a very early stage the possible outcomes of autonomous mobility. One is that the need for parking will be eliminated. Currently, parking is essentially a culture where people are using their metal boxes to get around, they own them, and they want to keep them as close as possible until they are outside of them, just to make it easier for themselves to use it again when they need it next time. That's what essentially parking is. But this need of storing your vehicle as close as possible will be eliminated if your car using culture will be replaced by another one where you don't use the same car in the afternoon, which you used in the morning, but you call another one by some taxi company or shared taxi companies. So this leads us to a situation where really cities can repurpose the huge amount of public spaces which are used for parking and provide the transportation modes, more pedestrian areas, more bus lanes, more micro-mobility or scooter, bike, whatever lanes. And on the other hand, it's very important to understand that if you just look on the other side of the bay here, you see that a huge residential and office development is going on, not too much public transportation, and endless amount of parking being built underneath them. If you really believe that this autonomous mobility is not around the corner, but it's less than 30 years away from here, then all these real estate developers are lying to their banks, because they say that these parking garages will return in 30 years. That's the average return time of all these projects. So I'm just saying that we have to really rethink how we look at transportation if we believe that autonomous mobility is coming. And it's important to understand that public transport is very much needed. There is a lot of scientific studies which show that the need for public transportation, need for high-capacity solutions to get people from A to B won't be eliminated by autonomous mobility. And in terms of regulation, I'm how to say it politely, I'm a little overwhelmed by always talking about cybersecurity because the society doesn't really care about these issues, for example, by driverless metros. If someone hacks a driverless metro, they can kill 1,000 people easily. But it doesn't happen. There are regulations in place, and the society never asks questions that how people don't hack the line 14 of the Paris metro, or the same with autopilot systems on planes. So I think that it's we are really a bit too concerned about this whole issue, while in our daily lives we don't care. If you ask people in the Metro Line 4 at this very moment that if they are thinking about cybersecurity in Metro Line 4, I'm not sure that there is any of them who has this thought in their daily life. And they are in a metro which doesn't have any human presence. But on the other hand, as we see that what companies are investing most heavily in this industry, I think there are a lot of other threats for cities and societies in this case. For example, if driverless cars will start their service-based operations as advertisement spaces, how we will react to that? What will happen if the question won't be that driverless taxis are just 20 or 40% cheaper than a traditional taxi with a human driver, and if we just exclude the human driver, it will get cheaper, and how cheaper it will be, and will it be as competitive as an alternative to traditional car ownership or not? The question will be, how will cities react if driverless taxis will be free until you watch the advertisements which Google, YouTube, or whatever companies will deliver to you? And how we will react if driverless cars will come moving brothels and the sex industry will find them maybe in one of the first application of this technology, which is already foreseen in some studies. So I think that that this really will turn into an issue because it will have a direct effect on mobility. If mobility becomes essentially free, just in exchange for watching advertisements and using your time in some kind of way, how some major technology and advertisement companies expect you to spend your time, then this will have a direct impact on mobility, and even the cheapest and most subsidized bus ticket will be a lot more expensive than that. So I think we should think about regulation in this case, in this sense as well, from the very early stage, and not just focus on accidents and cybersecurity, on issues which we already solved in many other transportation modes which are autonomous, but not cars.
Having in mind that we need to give space for the next presenter who are as well transforming this industry, I would like to do a last round connecting to these thoughts, because we just said discuss about regulations. Ádám, what is your last thoughts about the topic?
I think that's still a big threat. So that these all these vehicles, so that the Budapest transport system isn't yet attacked by hackers. That doesn't mean that we do not need to prepare, because the experience shows, for example, so Ukraine, which is now actually in a war, hackers have shut down an entire hospital or a power plant, which might cause significant damage to society. And that's the reason that public systems just need more stricter regulation, and also the use of cars, because this is a dangerous activity, and as long as it poses danger to our society, there must be very strict regulations and very strict enforcement of security standards. And that's also the reason that a car from the 50s can still run on the street, and there is no need for any upgrades for such a car. But an autonomous car, which is a modern car, which doesn't need any driver interaction anymore, that needs the development, that needs the upgrades, and also the developers have to calculate in that what happens if the owner does not upgrade the car anymore, about security issues that may cause to society itself. So as long as these issues are acute, there must be a very strict regulation, and this must be enforced.
I've got one. Yeah, I think on that kind of idea of the promising, what we want from this, I really like that example of how we can make our cities more human-centered as well. I've got to say, it's not something that occurred to me before, and I think that point of people kind of culturally being wedded to their vehicles, we'll get rid of that much quicker if we can see that additional thing we gain of, oh, wait a second, now I can turn that driveway space into a larger house, and the green spaces are better, and the architecture changes and all becomes so much nicer for us for that vast majority of our time that we're not spent in our cars. there's the very obvious one about the kind of protection that we can give to human life over this as well. And I think it's almost twofold. It's the person who's injured, we can really cut that down, as well as if you're the person sitting in that vehicle, you don't want to bear witness to that sort of thing. And we can really cut down the number of times when people are injured and the number of times when people have to bear witness to an injury, feeling in some way as though they've been responsible as the person in control of the vehicle. I think in a very basic sense as well, there's just a huge amount of time to be saved and reallocated from that. I try to think my time spent driving is as productive as possible by listening to audiobooks, but I'm sure I could be doing better things with that time. I would much rather be doing any number of things than staring at the road ahead of me and getting very bored of that. Yeah, as we do, that's why we're such terrible drivers, because the vast majority of the driving we do isn't on a racetrack. It's very dull. I'd love to regain that time and do something better with it. And yeah, autonomous vehicles are the one thing which I think will bring us to that stage.
I couldn't agree with you more. All of you, basically. The thing that David just said about autonomous vehicles making driving even cheaper, for instance, by offering you the possibility of watching ads while you are there. That's one of my number one nightmares. This is just the most miserable thing that you can imagine happening. And I'm absolutely 100% sure that it will happen anyhow. What I feel is that if you look at it from a distance and from an evolutionary perspective, in many ways we are still those very basic biological beings that was shaped by evolution the way we are now, which means that we as individuals tend to change much slower. And there are things that we are inherently attracted to. One of those things is not exerting energy and effort if there is no clear requirement for it. That means that we are very quick to adopt any change that makes it easier for us to be happy from an evolutionary point of view. If we don't have to work for something, we feel happier about it. If we don't have to drive our cars, we are happier, so we will adopt it quickly. Even if it means that there are new dangers and many people will be anxious about handing over control of their lives. This is the main issue with air travel as well, because statistically everybody knows that air travel is pretty much the safest, and yet the most people are anxious about air travel because they hand over control. This will apply to autonomous driving as well, but air travel is flourishing, and so will autonomous cars in the end, because it is easier and people will have no problems with that. From the security side, I feel that the security of autonomous technology is incredibly important, and I'm very much afraid of the fact that in that regard we are more or less, how to put it politely, fucked already. And the reason for that is that the rate of development at the cutting edge is so much faster than the rate and the quality of public discussion, and the way that turns into legislation, that it is just hopeless that legislation can in any way get in front of the advances of technology. Which means that the best thing that we can hope for is that the basic business sense for making these services as secure as possible align with the need for all of us from the point of view of society of making these really bulletproof. But if you just consider the last few years, for instance, the Russian meddling into the American elections, the Chinese efforts to reroute some of the internet traffic to gain data, etc., etc. It means that the more space we hand over for autonomy from our lives means that we are handing over a proportionally bigger size of or proportion of our safety. Because Russians couldn't kill you, Russian hackers couldn't kill you most of the time now. They could kill you if everybody is in a self-driving vehicle. And I wouldn't say that they will. I just say that it gives another possibility, and they could kill you by launching the nuclear strikes as well, either from their own rockets or from some other hacked country's rockets. So the threat itself isn't actually bigger. It's just another kind of vulnerability that needs to be addressed. And the last thing is that there's an American journalist called Alex Roy, who has founded the Human Driving Association. The Human Driving Association is about the right of preserving the right to drive. So even as you hand over control, even as most people or whole societies decide to be able to hand over control, he feels that it's very important that there remains the right for those people who want to opt out from this system to be able to do so. He has very personal and touching examples from his life, historical ones, where the fact that he had access to a vehicle saved the life of his family during the Second World War, for instance. And he says that if we just let this go, that means that during these stages, when your life might depend on your ability to drive a vehicle and get fast from point A to point B, even though you are not doing what you are legally supposed to be doing, because in occupied France you are not supposed to be driving and trying to get out. And the fact that you could do it meant that you might stay alive or die. And this is also a very interesting aspect. Of course, we cannot discuss it here, but I feel that it would be important to try to keep this tiny little piece of legislation for those who feel that they would like to have the opportunity to drive their own, as long as they are willing not to kill other people by doing so.
Yes, thank you. My experience is usually that these conversations really accelerate after the first hour. But today our time is up, so I hope we can take this discussion to another platform. I hope you will join too. So thank you very much that you shared your thoughts about how you shape the future and as well the future of mobility. Thank you very much for your attention as well, and of course for the passion which you drive the change, the transformation of this digital age. So I guess all of you who attended here on this conference takes a little or even a big part of shaping the future. So thank you so much for that, and I will give the word back to Otto. Thank you.
Thank you.